Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling stories to ever emerge from the Ozark Mountains. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. It's always fascinating to see how far these accounts travel and at what hour they're being heard. Deep within the misty forests of the Ozarks, where the fog clings to the trees like ghostly hands, lies a tale that history has tried hard to bury. The year was 1776, remembered across the East for revolution and the birth of a nation. But in the remote wilderness that would later become Missouri and Arkansas, another kind of darkness was taking shape. Records trace the Pruitts family back to Virginia, where Nathaniel Pruitt, born in 1734, to English immigrants, made his living as a carpenter and farmer. In 1756, he married Sarah Blackwood, and together they built a life on a modest farm near Williamsburg, raising 5 children over nearly 20 years. Yet by 1775, things were unraveling. A letter to his cousin reveals Nathaniel was drowning in debt, and he spoke of the chance to claim new land in the Western Territories, enough to leave a lasting legacy for his children. Another note from that same year hinted at a different worry: Sarah's failing health after the birth of their youngest, with a doctor suggesting a change of climate might help. Whatever the reasons, the Pruitts began their journey west. A Kentucky merchant's ledger shows their purchase of supplies in February 1776, and a military record confirms their passage through a frontier fort a month later. By April, they had reached the western slopes of the Ozarks, where Nathaniel secured a 200-acre claim near present-day Jasper County. The land was described as fertile and well-watered, with limestone bluffs, timber, and open meadows. A missionary traveling through the area that summer wrote in his journal of finding the Pruitt family hard at work building a sturdy log cabin. He noted that Nathaniel's home was larger and more carefully constructed than most on the frontier, with separate sleeping quarters, a spacious common room, and even a root cellar for provisions. He also observed that the family seemed in good health and high spirits, with Sarah appearing much improved from her earlier illness. Nathaniel's hope for a new life was clear in a letter he wrote to his cousin in Virginia during July of 1776. He described Sarah thriving in the mountain air, her melancholy gone as she worked the garden with an energy she hadn't known since before Rebecca's birth. The children seemed equally transformed. Thomas helped him improve the claim, while the girls had turned a corner of the cabin into a makeshift classroom where Elizabeth taught her younger siblings their letters. Nathaniel's words painted a picture of abundance. The soil, he wrote, yielded corn beans, squash, and potatoes with ease. The forests were alive with game, and the stream by their door offered fish in plenty. Honest labor, he believed, could provide all they would ever need. For a time, it seemed the Pruitts had found the fresh start they sought. But optimism soon gave way to something darker. In 1952, a historian named Arthur Fleming uncovered a fragment of Nathaniel's journal that marked a chilling turn. Dated September 18, 1776, it told of Thomas stumbling upon a cave hidden in the limestone bluff behind the house. Though eager to explore, the boy was held back by his father's unease. Nathaniel admitted he had no wish to enter, haunted by a sense that the cave concealed more than shadows. Sarah, too, warned that some places were best left untouched. On September 30th, the journal's tone grew more ominous. Nathaniel wrote of a sound that began 3 nights earlier, a low rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the cave. Sarah and the younger children heard nothing. But Thomas confessed it kept him awake, describing it as a heartbeat that didn't sound quite human. Nathaniel tried to dismiss it as wind through the rocks, but his words betrayed doubt. 2 weeks later, the unease deepened. On October 12th, Nathaniel recorded that Thomas's obsession with the cave had grown disturbing. Twice he found the boy standing before the entrance at dawn, unable to explain how he got there. Strange markings had appeared in the dirt symbols, carved in a circle unfamiliar and unsettling. Thomas denied making them, and they seemed far beyond a child's hand. Nathaniel covered them with stones and forbade his children from going near the bluff. Yet the strangeness spread. By October 24th, Elizabeth too had begun hearing the sounds, though she described them not as pulsing, but as voices singing without words. Nathaniel noticed a silent bond forming between her and Thomas, something hidden that unsettled him more than he admitted. 3 nights later, his daughter Catherine was found at the hearth at midnight, staring into the flames without blinking. When he touched her shoulder, she turned with an expression he described only as hunger, yet not for food. Nathaniel's account grew darker still. He described how one night Catherine spoke a sentence in a language he did not recognize, her voice impossibly deep for a girl of 12. By morning, she remembered nothing of it. On November 3rd, he wrote of strange symbols appearing not only outside the cave, but etched into the very walls of their home, hidden behind furniture, beneath rugs, and in the corners of rooms. No one was ever caught making them, yet they multiplied each day. Sarah, now uneasy herself, suggested fever or frontier madness, but Nathaniel believed something far more sinister was at work. The entry from November 12th is chilling. The sound had returned louder and closer, not from the cave, but from beneath their feet. The children heard it too, though they no longer spoke of it aloud. Thomas had taken to sleeping in the root cellar, claiming voices called his name in the night. A week later, on November 20th, Nathaniel recorded that Sarah discovered marks on the children's bodies. Small burns across their shoulders and backs, forming incomprehensible patterns. She accused him of cruelty, but he swore he had not touched them. Stranger still, Elizabeth could suddenly recite passages of scripture she had never learned, smiling when asked how she knew them, her teeth appearing somehow different. The final journal entry, dated December 2nd, 1776, is short and desperate. I have found what lies beneath the root cellar. God forgive me for bringing my family here. They are in the walls now. They speak with borrowed tongues. I have failed to protect them from what waited here long before us. The French trader comes in 5 days. Perhaps there is still time. That trader was Jean-Baptiste Duval, whose own records provide the first outside account of the Pruitts homestead. His ledger, sealed for nearly 2 centuries before being made public in 1968, recounts what he found on December 7th, 1776. He wrote of arriving at midday to see smoke curling from the chimney and the cabin outwardly in good order. Yet something was wrong. The silence was unnatural, heavy, without a trace of animal or human sound. The front door hung open, and inside he found a scene frozen in eerie perfection. A meal still warm laid upon the table 5 places. Set though the family numbered 7 garments folded neatly on chairs, and the fire in the hearth burning low. The family Bible sat open, certain passages in the book of Judges smeared with what Duval believed to be blood. Though he would not transcribe the verses, he admitted they were familiar lines that unsettled him deeply. He called out and searched the cabin, finding no signs of departure, no tracks in the fresh snow. Nothing to suggest the family had left of their own accord, and yet he felt watched as if the walls themselves were alive with eyes. In the root cellar, he made a final cryptic note lines of his entry, deliberately obscured with ink, as though what he discovered there was too terrible to record. Duval's ledger closes with a final warning. Some things are best left undocumented lest they take root in one's dreams. He confessed to fleeing the valley in haste, riding through the night despite the dangers of the frontier. So desperate was his need to escape that place. True to his word, he reported the disappearance to the colonial administrator at Fort Charlesworth. though he doubted much would come of it given the war and the isolation of the region. A later entry dated December 10th confirms he made his report, and that 3 militiamen, Corporal James Harlow, Private William Scherer, and Private Thomas Jenkins, were dispatched to investigate the Pruitts homestead. Duval refused to accompany them, writing that no sum of money could persuade him to return. What happened next is buried in contradictions. No official report of the militia's findings survives. Instead, a single note in the duty roster dated January 20th, 1777, marked the 3 men as deserted, their pay forfeited. That phrasing was unusual, even suspicious, as soldiers who failed to return from sanctioned missions were normally recorded as missing. This discrepancy caught the attention of Claude Fontaine, the colonial administrator who had ordered the mission. In a letter to his superior, dated January 25, 1777, later uncovered in university archives, Fontaine expressed alarm. He noted the disappearance of the Pruitts family, followed by the loss of 3 soldiers, and hinted at the possibility of something beyond Indian raids or natural misfortune. He pressed for a larger armed expedition, citing both Duval's fearful silence and the troubling proximity of the homestead to the vast cave systems of the Ozarks, which had recently been surveyed by Dr. Montrose' geological party. No record survives of any official reply to Fontaine's plea. What does exist is a military dispatch from February 8, 1777. It reported that Lieutenant Burke and 6 men investigated disturbances near the western limestone formations and found no evidence of human activity. The language is deliberately vague, avoiding any mention of the Pruitts or their cabin, suggesting a cover-up, rather than a failure to find the truth. By March of that year, the matter seems to have been erased from the colonial record entirely. A land survey conducted in April described the area only as unclaimed parcel formerly registered to Pruitts, a bureaucratic sleight of hand that returned the homestead to inventory with unusual speed. Normally, land claims lingered in family names for years, even after abandonment or death, to allow heirs the chance to reclaim them. In this case, the slate was wiped clean. If the story had ended there, the Pruitts might have been forgotten altogether. Yet oral tradition carried what official records sought to erase. As settlers pushed deeper into the Ozarks during the early 1800s, whispers of the vanished family lingered in campfire tales. Reverend Silas Whitman, a circuit preacher in the region between 1818 and 1832, recorded some of these stories in his personal papers later preserved in the Arkansas Historical Society. He wrote of old-timers who spoke of a family that ignored warnings and built their cabin over an Indian burial ground. According to these accounts, the father found a cave opening and began hearing voices calling from the dark. The children changed first, becoming withdrawn and strange, their eyes reflecting no light. Soon after, the mother walked the night speaking in tongues unknown to any Christian ear. The father held out the longest, but in the end he too was claimed by what lay beneath the earth. When Duval found the Pruitts homestead, the family was gone. But something wearing their skins lingered for a time. The 3 militiamen sent to investigate never returned, and when a larger party finally arrived, they discovered the cabin empty, except for strange markings carved into nearly every surface. The men burned the house to the ground in an effort to cleanse it, yet the land itself remained cursed. Nothing would grow there, and even animals avoided the place. More disturbing still were the stories whispered by travelers who claimed to see children near the ruins. At twilight, children whose eyes reflected no light, who beckoned strangers to follow them below to meet the family. Those who followed it, was said, were never seen again. Reverend Whitman, who at first dismissed these accounts as frontier superstition, later admitted he was troubled by how often they appeared across distant settlements. He noted that families 50 miles apart, with no knowledge of one another, told nearly identical versions of the same tale. Either some shared truth lay beneath it, or the folklore had spread with uncanny persistence in a region where communication was rare and slow. In 1841, William Porter of St. Louis became the first historian to attempt a serious investigation of the Pruitts incident. His interest was sparked by scattered references in the correspondence of Claude Fontaine, the colonial administrator who had once ordered men to the homestead. Porter's surviving research notes, preserved in part by the Missouri Historical Society, reveal his frustration at every turn. His first inquiries at the territorial archives yielded almost nothing, with several documents marked in inventory lists missing from their expected locations. He called the pattern suspicious evidence that records had not simply been lost, but withheld. Porter tracked down descendants of Jean-Baptiste Duval near Sainte-Geneviève, hoping their family papers might contain more detail. He also combed through church registers that recorded the Pruitts' lives before their disappearance. But again, barriers arose. Requests to examine Fontaine's sealed correspondence were denied without explanation. Military records from Fort Charlesworth, covering the crucial months, were said to be lost. A territorial archivist blanched at the mention of the name Pruitt and insisted no such records existed, despite Porter having seen them referenced in indices. A retired officer gave him a warning couched as advice. Some matters, he said, are better left alone. Yet Porter pressed on, turning to private journals and oral histories. His breakthrough came from the diary of Elizabeth Carver, wife of a soldier stationed at Fort Charlesworth in 1777. In an entry dated February 20th of that year, she wrote of her husband James, who had returned from the Pruitt expedition much altered. He would not speak of what had happened, but woke nightly in terror, pressing his ear to the cabin floorboards, listening as though to something beneath. She discovered him carving strange marks into the beams of their home symbols she later recognized as those described on the body of Private Jenkins, one of the missing soldiers, when his remains were returned. James swore he had no memory of making the carvings. Dr. Hartford, the fort physician, confided to her that Jenkins had not died of any wound or sickness, but as if life itself had been drawn out of him over days. Before his death, the soldier repeated a single phrase over and over: those who wait below, and the replacement that must occur. Elizabeth Carver's journal made it clear that James would not speak of Jenkins or Scherer, changing the subject whenever their names were mentioned. This detail confirmed for the first time that at least one of the militia, Thomas Jenkins, had returned from the investigation, only to die under circumstances no physician could explain. It also introduced three elements that would echo through every telling of the Pruitt mystery: the strange markings, the whispered warning of those who wait below, and the unsettling notion of replacement. Porter's notes reveal that he tracked down the family of Corporal James Harlow, the man long listed as a deserter. Meeting with Jacob Harlow, the corporal's great-grandson, Porter recorded an oral history far stranger than any official account. According to Jacob, Harlow had not deserted at all. He returned home alive, but broken, plagued by visions and erratic behavior. In his final weeks, he tried to lead his own children into a cave near the family farm, insisting that the family below wished to meet them. When he was restrained, he carved symbols into the walls of the outbuilding, where he was kept speaking in voices that shifted, sometimes his own, sometimes those of children. Before his death, he gave his wife a final warning: they look like us. They sound like us, but they are not us. They are patient, so patient. They have always been here, waiting beneath. After his death, the building was burned, but one relic survived. Jacob produced a leather pouch holding a small wooden square carved with markings. He allowed Porter to make a drawing, but refused to part with the piece, explaining that family tradition demanded the artifact stay with Harlow blood, or misfortune would follow. Porter's sketch depicts stylized human figures arranged in a circle around what looks like the entrance to a tunnel or cave. At the time, Porter made no connection, but later researchers would note a disturbing resemblance to prehistoric rock art found in Ozark caves. The most damning discovery came not from folklore, but from a sealed letter Porter unearthed in the private papers of Claude Fontaine's granddaughter, dated March 10, 1777. It was written in confidence to Fontaine's superior. In it, Fontaine admitted to the destruction of the Pruitts homestead and to the systematic removal of records actions he justified as necessary. Yet he confessed to being deeply troubled by what he had seen. The markings found in the Pruitts dwelling, he wrote, matched those documented the previous summer in the deepest chambers of the cave system, behind the homestead markings Dr. Montreux had attributed to an ancient indigenous civilization. More unsettling still were the discoveries in the root cellar, which had been built over a natural shaft leading down into those caves. Inside were cloth pouches filled with human remains of varying ages, suggesting that whatever had taken hold of the Pruitts had haunted that ground for generations. Fontaine relayed Jenkins's dying testimony, in which he claimed to have seen Harlow and Scherer alive in the caves, though they were no longer truly themselves. The description of their altered faces and strange behavior matched almost exactly what Duval had once written about the Pruitts children. Fontaine's letter described the last sight of the Pruitts family as a perfect stillness, faces fixed in unnatural smiles, and eyes that absorbed light rather than reflected it. He claimed the immediate threat had been contained by sealing the most accessible cave mouths and erasing all mention of the Pruitts claim from colonial records. Yet he admitted to a gnawing fear that what they had done was not a solution, but only a delay. The limestone beneath that valley was honeycombed with passages many too narrow for a grown man, but perhaps wide enough for children. He urged that no settlement be permitted within 5 miles of the claim using the cover of disputed titles or military need, and insisted that any unusual disappearances be reported directly to the highest authorities. This is not a single tragedy, Fontaine confessed. It is the discovery of something that has existed beside us for untold generations. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it reaches up to claim those who wander too close. His words stand as the earliest documented acknowledgement of an official cover-up and the first suggestion that the Pruitts incident was not an isolated horror, but part of something ancient. Nearly 70 years later, in 1841, William Porter's own journal recorded how deeply his research had shaken him. "I now understand why this matter has been buried," he wrote. "What happened in that valley was not simply misfortune, but something that bends the limits of human understanding. The pattern of events across decades points to an influence that reappears whenever people settle near those underground spaces. I will abandon this pursuit and destroy what I have gathered. The knowledge itself feels dangerous." Porter confessed to strange disturbances after handling the Harlow artifact nights, filled with unnatural dreams, waking trances, where he found himself tracing the forbidden symbols on his study walls, and a growing obsession with the sound of a heartbeat beneath his own floorboards. He ended with a final admission he was hearing what Nathaniel Pruitt had described so many years before. Days later, a fire destroyed his study and the notes he had sworn to destroy. Porter survived, but refused to speak of the matter again. He died 3 years later, his once bright career in ruins. For almost 80 years after Porter's death, the Pruitt mystery drifted into silence, preserved only in whispers of local folklore. But in the mid-19th century, the pattern re-emerged. In 1847, court records describe the Collins family who settled 10 miles from the original Pruitt claim. Within months, neighbors reported unsettling behavior in the Collins children, long stretches of silence speaking together in perfect unison and standing motionless in their yard for hours, staring at the ground as if listening for something below. When authorities investigated the Collins homestead, they discovered the parents in a state of unbroken catatonia, and the walls scrawled with markings nearly identical to those found in the suppressed colonial reports. The children told investigators that the people under the floor had instructed them to prepare for the replacement. All 6 members of the family were committed to an asylum in St. Louis, where they died within a year, never giving a coherent account of what had happened. The attending physician, Dr. Frederick Schaefer, kept meticulous notes. Portions of these notes, rediscovered in 1962 during renovations of the asylum, described the case in chilling detail. The Collins children, Schaefer wrote, present a most unusual instance of shared delusion, or folia familiale. All 4, aged 6 through 13, maintain an identical narrative concerning entities said to dwell beneath their former home. These beings, the children claimed, looked almost human, but with subtle differences: eyes that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, movements that flowed unnaturally, and voices that bypassed the ears to speak directly into the mind. Most disturbing was the children's insistence that these entities were gradually replacing humans in the region, beginning with isolated families. Whenever pressed to explain the replacement, the children grew agitated and began carving symbols into the furniture and walls, symbols eerily similar to those linked to cases of religious mania, despite their lack of exposure to such material. The Collins parents remained unresponsive to all treatment. Their silence broke only during episodes of glossolalia, when they spoke in a strange mixture of Osage fragments of other indigenous dialects and an unknown language that scholars could not identify. Physical examination revealed geometric patterns of small, perfectly circular lesions, each about a 1/4 inch in diameter, across their shoulders, skull base, and upper backs. The cause was neither disease nor trauma. Schaefer's final note is perhaps the most troubling. I'm forced to consider whether the Collins family's condition might stem not solely from psychological origin, but from environmental factors unique to their settlement. The proximity to the infamous Pruitts incident of 1776, which I once dismissed as frontier myth, now strikes me as significant. He reported contacting the Missouri Historical Society for access to records on the earlier case, but no reply survives. After the Collins deaths, asylum records note that Schaefer took indefinite leave for health reasons. He never returned, abandoning psychiatry altogether. He relocated to Boston and spent his remaining years studying plants, never again writing of the Collins family. But the pattern did not end there. Similar cases appeared in 1879, 1904, and 1936. Always in the same part of the Ozarks, always the same signs, strange behavior markings etched into homes, and whispered references to those who wait beneath the earth. Each official inquiry ended with survivors confined to asylums or reports of suicide and murder-suicide, while alternative explanations were ignored. The 1879 case centered on the Whitaker family, who had settled just 15 miles from the ruins of the Pruitts homestead. Church records from 1879 preserve a letter from the local pastor to his bishop expressing unease about the Whitakers. "The children have not attended Sunday school in 3 weeks," he wrote. Upon visiting the family, I found a troubling change. Once lively and inquisitive, the children now sit in perfect stillness, speaking only when addressed, and then with words that sound practiced rather than natural. Mrs. Whitaker appears dazed, though she insists she has taken no medicine. Mr. Whitaker was absent, said to be working on improvements to the root cellar. Most disturbing were the marking symbols carved into the underside of furniture, and even on the back of sacred paintings. They are of no Christian design, I know. When questioned, 12-year-old Mary Whitaker told him calmly that those below required them for the preparation. When pressed further, she smiled in what the pastor described as a predatory way. He closed the letter by begging his bishop for guidance. No reply is recorded. 2 weeks later, a local paper reported that the Whitaker home had burned to the ground in what was described as an accident involving an overturned lantern during a family quarrel. The remains of the family were said to have been recovered and buried in the churchyard, yet no record of their burial exists in the cemetery register. The 1904 Miller case was far better documented, coinciding with a period of broader press coverage in rural Missouri. John Miller, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children had left Chicago to build a self-sufficient farm deep in the Ozarks. 6 months after their arrival, neighbors alerted the sheriff after not seeing them for over a week. On October 12th, the Jefferson County Gazette carried the headline, "Family Tragedy in Remote Settlement." Deputies had entered the Miller home to find all 5 members dead seated together around the dining table as if awaiting a meal. Sheriff Wilson told reporters, "It's the strangest case I've encountered in 15 years. No sign of violence, no sign of struggle. They look as though life simply left them." The medical examiner ordered the bodies sent to St. Louis, noting that the family appeared to have been dead for days. Meanwhile, neighbors reported the Millers had grown increasingly withdrawn, pulling their children from school and limiting contact with outsiders. Deputies investigating the property discovered extensive modifications. The root cellar had been expanded into a labyrinth of chambers, burrowing deep into the limestone cliffs behind the house. Throughout the cellar and across the house were marking symbols Sheriff Wilson refused to describe in detail. A week later, a follow-up article offered a tidy explanation. Dr. James Harrison, the examiner, declared the family had died from eating poisonous mushrooms, mistaking them for something edible. Yet no mushrooms were found in the house, nor traces in the victims' stomachs. And nothing explained why they had all remained seated calmly at the table as the alleged poison took effect. More telling was a private letter discovered in 1965 during research on early Ozark law enforcement. It was written by Deputy Samuel Jenkins to his brother. "I cannot shake the memory of what we found at the Miller place," he confessed. The official report speaks of them seated at the table, but it does not capture the wrongness of it. Deputy Jenkins's private letter described what the official reports concealed. The Miller family's bodies were not peaceful, as the sheriff claimed, but empty. Arranged too perfectly, their faces vacant, as if something essential had been extracted from them. The markings covered every surface: walls, ceilings, floors, even carved into chairs and etched across silverware. They were not simple graffiti, but intricate patterns that seemed to shift if you stared too long. Jenkins admitted he felt watched, as though the symbols were studying him in return. The root cellar disturbed him most. While reports mentioned modifications, they omitted that the Millers had excavated a 30-foot tunnel into the bluff behind their home. At its end yawned a vertical shaft that swallowed light. Torches dropped into it were extinguished before reaching bottom. Near the shaft, they found John Miller's journal. The early entries spoke of farm life, but by August his words had changed. He wrote of voices without words echoing from the bluff at night, of children pressing their ears to the stone as if listening for something. In his final entry dated October 1st, he confessed, "They are not speaking to us. They are speaking through us. I fear we have become vessels for something that has waited in darkness for generations." The sheriff, after reading, ordered the journal burned and forbade mention of the shaft, commanding the coroner to list a natural cause for the deaths. Jenkins could not accept it. He resigned writing his account, so at least some trace of the truth would survive, then left Missouri altogether. 3 decades later, in 1936, the cycle returned with the Larson family. Edward Larson, a journalist from Chicago, had come to the Ozarks to research disappearances for a book. He brought his wife and 2 children, moving into a farmhouse not far from the ruins of the Pruitts claim. Neighbors recalled that within 2 months after renovations to the home's root cellar, the family changed. Withdrawn, secretive, their once friendly children became silent and strange. The official record states that Edward Larson murdered his family before taking his own life. Yet those who responded told a different story. Deputies found the Larsons seated together at the dining table, showing no sign of struggle or injury. Their faces looked wrong, one deputy said, stretched as if their features had been pulled taut like masks. All four stared at the same spot on the floor. The walls of the house were covered in markings no one could read, symbols, repeating the same dreadful pattern seen before. Most unsettling was the open door of the root cellar. None of the men would enter, not after Jenkins's warnings of what lay below. One deputy resigned the following week, and like Jenkins before him, vanished from the state. His testimony, never officially recorded, was pieced together only through fragments uncovered decades later. The Larson case might have faded into obscurity like so many before it, were it not for a discovery in 1967 during the probate of Helen Milner's estate. Milner, a retired librarian in Springfield, Missouri, left instructions that a sealed box among her belongings be destroyed upon her death. Instead, her nephew opened it later, calling the decision the greatest regret of my life. Inside were Edward Larson's research materials, extensive notes on the Pruitts disappearance, and similar cases, along with his own journals from 1936. How Milner came to possess them remains a mystery. The journals provide the most detailed first-hand account of what Larson came to call the replacement. At first, his notes are ordinary. March 15th, he describes settling into the Ozark farmhouse, his wife Marion and their children adjusting uneasily to the isolation while he organizes research on regional disappearances. He notes the striking similarities across decades isolated families, sudden changes in children's behavior, voices from below, and the recurring motif of replacement. By March 30th, Larson's tone shifts. While expanding the root cellar, he breaks into a narrow, natural cave leading to a chamber with fire pits, tool marks, and symbols carved into the walls, symbols identical to those described in the Pruitts case. On April 10th, deeper exploration yields a corroded metal box containing papers and a leather-bound journal. The handwriting, Larson insists, matches Nathaniel Pruitts' signature from colonial records. The journal contains drawings of the same symbols found in the cave, along with instructions for a ritual whose purpose is unclear. The following weeks descend into horror. April 18th, Larson records that his daughter Emily heard singing from the walls, voices without words matching accounts from 1776 almost verbatim. His son Michael becomes fixated on the root cellar, sitting before its door for hours. On April 25th, Marion discovers circular lesions on Emily's back, arranged in geometric patterns. Larson secretly recognizes the design from the cave walls. Michael begins compulsively drawing interconnected symbols, telling his father, "The people under the floor showed me." By early May, the family's transformation accelerates. The children begin finishing each other's sentences, sometimes speaking in unison, seemingly unaware of it. They whisper constantly, but fall silent when adults approach. Marion reports hearing a heartbeat beneath the floor, but wrong somehow. On May 12th, Larson admits he hears it too, the same rhythmic pulsing Nathaniel Pruitts described in 1776. The children speak openly now of those who wait below and the preparation. Marion herself develops the strange circular markings, and Larson confesses to carving symbols into furniture, without realizing it, driven by a compulsion he cannot resist. By May 20th, he writes that Marion no longer sleeps. Larson's final journal entries read like the last confessions of a man staring into an abyss. "She stands at the foot of our bed," he wrote of Marion, "watching me with an expression I cannot name." The children speak in voices that are not their own, telling me that what waits beneath has always been here before the settlers, before the first people of this land. They have shown me the markings I must carve so the replacement can occur. I understand now why the Pruitts affair was hidden, why every other case was buried. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. The next day, May 21st, 1936, his words turned final. They are in the house now. I see them moving behind my children's eyes. Marion no longer speaks, only smiles. The children tell me that what waits beneath has been patient for centuries, slowly spreading family by family. I have doomed us by coming here. I hear them on the cellar stairs. They wear my family's faces, but they are not my family. God forgive me for what I must do. That entry was dated one day before the Larson family was found dead at their dining table. The materials were seized by federal authorities and sealed as so many records had been before. Milner's nephew, who had read the journals before surrendering them later, suffered a nervous collapse. In treatment, he muttered endlessly about the replacement and covered his walls with the same symbols Larson had drawn. The clustering of these tragedies in the Ozark region led some researchers to suspect a connection to its unusual geology. The limestone beneath the mountains is riddled with vast cave systems, many containing evidence of human use stretching back thousands of years. Indigenous traditions speak of certain caves as thresholds between worlds, thin places where other realms press close to ours. Archaeologists have found ceremonial deposits and rock art in remote caverns, figures with warped faces, symbols strikingly similar to those described in the Pruitt case and its echoes. In 1923, anthropologist Margaret Welch collected Ozark folklore for Washington University in St. Louis. Her recordings remained restricted until 1967, when fragments were released to scholars. Among them was the voice of 94-year-old Joseph Miller, recounting what his grandfather had said of the vanished family. They didn't just disappear, he insisted. They were there, and then they weren't, but something stayed behind. Something that wore their faces for a time. That's why the old folks burned the house. Fire cleanses. Another voice, Martha Cowley, spoke of her great-grandmother's journal, which claimed that when searchers first found the Pruitt children, they were sitting silently at the table, as if waiting for supper. They'd been like that for 3 days, the account read. They didn't eat, didn't drink, just sat there and smiled. And their eyes, God help me, their eyes weren't right. These oral histories preserved what official records never dared state outright. The replacements were not merely madness, not illness, not myth, but something that looked human only long enough to take their place at the table. Some accounts claim the Pruitt children were not dead when first discovered, but changed. They sat at the family's table refusing food or water, yet somehow surviving for days in a state of eerie stillness. According to oral tradition, they were carried to a church in a neighboring settlement in hopes of salvation. What happened inside that church varies in retellings, but every version ends the same way: the church was consumed by fire under mysterious circumstances. No colonial records mention such a blaze, suggesting deliberate erasure. Nearly 2 centuries later, anthropologist Catherine Reynolds offered the most provocative theory in a paper written in 1965, but rejected for publication. She proposed that the Pruitts had unknowingly settled atop a site of ceremonial importance to indigenous peoples, a place long associated with altered states or dangerous crossings between worlds. Reynolds suggested that the combination of environmental toxins, geological anomalies, and psychological strain could explain the recurring symptoms documented in case after case. Indigenous warnings about caves as doorways to other realms, she wrote, may preserve cultural memory of very real dangers linked to these environments. Her research pointed to recurring features: auditory hallucinations, compulsive creation of symbols, synchronized behavior, sensations of possession, and finally collapse into silence or death. She argued these patterns aligned with exposure to psychoactive fungal spores, common in limestone cave systems, and compounded by long-term exposure to heavy metals, such as arsenic and mercury. A 1947 geological survey she uncovered identified precisely such deposits near the presumed site of the Pruitts homestead. In her analysis, the progression from hearing voices to seeing distorted figures to compulsive ritual, and finally to catatonia, followed a predictable neurotoxicological curve. Despite the strength of her argument, Reynolds's requests for funding were denied. Like others before her, she reported disturbing dreams and the sensation of being watched, eventually abandoning her research. Her reputation never recovered, and she left academia altogether, teaching high school in Arizona until her death. The last known incident to fit the Pruitts pattern occurred in 1952, when a family of 4 vanished from their farmhouse only 15 miles from the original Pruitts claim. At the time, the case drew little attention, dismissed as abandonment after the property was found to sit above an unstable cave system. No remains were ever recovered, and the house has stood empty since. What makes this case particularly haunting is who the father was. Dr. Richard Conley, a respected geologist who had come to the Ozarks specifically to study karst formations. Even with all his expertise, Conley and his family disappeared into the same silence that had swallowed the Pruitts nearly 2 centuries before. Dr. Richard Conley's published work before his disappearance hinted at what was to come. In January 1952, his final paper described unusual mineral compositions in certain Ozark caves, noting that under specific conditions of temperature and humidity, these deposits could release airborne particles with potential neurological effects. He went so far as to suggest that historical accounts of strange psychological phenomena in the region might be rooted not in superstition, but in environmental exposure. 3 months later, Conley moved his family onto property near the site of the original Pruitts claim to conduct fieldwork. He never published again. When authorities investigated the family's disappearance that June, they found the Conley home eerily intact. A meal was set at the table untouched, the scene echoing the vanished Pruitts almost 2 centuries earlier. In the cellar, they discovered Conley's field journal. His final entries describe fungal growth patterns clustering around mineral deposits and the samples he collected. More troubling were his notes about his children, how they could navigate the caves without light, how they seemed to communicate without words. The last entry, dated June 3rd, reads, "They have always been here. Not a contamination, but a communion. The children already understand. Susan is beginning to accept. I am the last to comprehend what we are becoming. The replacement is not an end, but a transformation." Afterward, the property was quietly purchased by a historical preservation society, which fenced off the land under the guise of conservation. No development or research has been allowed since. Requests for access, whether from journalists or academics, have been denied without explanation. 7 years later, in 1959, the last living descendant of one of the original militia men broke her family's silence. In an interview with a local historian, the elderly woman revealed that her ancestor had not simply vanished, but returned changed. Confined to an outbuilding, he spoke in many voices and carved symbols into the walls until his death 3 weeks later. His last words to his wife were, "They look like us. They sound like us. But they are not us. They are patient. So patient. They have always been here waiting beneath." The Pruitts were only the beginning. A decade later, in 1968, construction workers renovating the Jasper County Courthouse stumbled upon a sealed compartment inside the wall. Within it lay a metal box containing late 18th century documents, including a partial report by a French colonial official. It described the Pruitts homestead not as a site of sudden disappearance, but of disturbing ritual. The cabin's walls had been inscribed with markings hidden beneath furniture. Beneath the floorboards, investigators uncovered pouches filled with teeth hair and bone fragments, some older than the Pruitts themselves, suggesting the family had found and perhaps repurposed them. Most disturbing was the cellar deliberately built above a natural cave entrance showing signs of ancient habitation. Markings, identical to those in the cabin, were carved deep into the stone. The report concluded not that the family had vanished, but that they had fled after awakening something long dormant beneath their home. Within a year of its discovery, the document was seized and sealed by federal order, locked away at the Missouri Historical Society, where it remains inaccessible to this day. The official explanation for sealing away the 1968 courthouse discovery was historical preservation. Yet researchers who requested access were denied without further comment. That same year, anthropologist Robert Chambers led an excavation at the presumed site of the Pruitt homestead. Field notes from his team confirmed they uncovered the charred foundation of a cabin and the remains of a filled-in root cellar. But efforts to dig further ended abruptly when 3 members of the crew reported sudden psychological distress. Nightmares, auditory hallucinations, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Chambers' official report, restrained almost to the point of denial, simply noted that the site appears to have cultural significance beyond its colonial occupation, with evidence of earlier indigenous use of a cave complex beneath the homestead. He concluded that further investigation was not recommended due to structural instability. Only after his death in 1976 did correspondence among Chambers' personal papers reveal what he had withheld. "The dreams began," he wrote to a colleague, "the night we uncovered the cave entrance. Always the same children seated around a table watching in silence. Behind them, something moves in the darkness, something waiting." The local workers refused to return after Thomas found the markings. They matched those described in the 1777 report exactly, though we had never shared those details with the team. How could they have known? And then the voices, the children's voices at night calling our names from the dark. The excavation was officially abandoned for budgetary reasons, the site backfilled and no marker placed. Chambers never returned to the field. He took a teaching post at a small college and avoided all further work connected to colonial Ozark settlements. By the 1970s, the mystery was preserved less in records than in folklore. In 1973, folklorist Ellen Rutledge began interviewing descendants of early settlers. Her work revealed a persistent motif passed down as the Pruitt warning, a set of signs said to foreshadow the recurrence of what befell the original family. These included unnatural silence in the forest, children speaking with unseen companions, strange burn-like markings on the skin, and the obsessive creation of certain symbols. The warnings came with prescriptions as well. Never build a home with a root cellar near limestone formations. If children speak in unison or show fascination with the ground, leave at once. Burn marked objects, but never touch them directly. And if circular lesions appear on family members, they must be separated immediately and permanently. Rutledge's findings suggested that local folklore had not merely invented the replacement myth, but preserved in distorted form a kind of cultural memory. A survival manual whispered down the generations by those who had lived too close to the caves. The persistence of the same symptoms across centuries, across families, suggests a shared experience, something more than coincidence or imagination. What gives the Pruitt mystery its enduring power is not simply the horror of one family's fate, but the implication that their story was only the first chapter in a much longer process. A process that unfolds quietly beneath the surface of history, claiming isolated households one by one, while eluding formal investigation. Equally disturbing is the pattern of suppression. From the burning of the Pruitt homestead to the sealing of colonial reports, from careers destroyed to researchers plagued by nightmares, The story is not just one of disappearance, but of deliberate erasure. If these were mere tragedies of isolation, madness, or environment, why the extraordinary effort to bury them? What knowledge was considered too dangerous to preserve? And if the threat has truly ended, why does secrecy remain generation after generation? The land itself remembers. In the Ozark forests, where mist clings to ancient trees like ghostly fingers, the Pruitts property has remained largely untouched. Locals avoid it, citing unstable caves and sinkholes, but their voices lower when they admit the real reason: the silence. Hunters speak of being watched. Maps of the area show blank patches where detail should be. Guides refuse to take visitors near. And sometimes, just sometimes, children vanish in those woods, only to return days later. They are unharmed, yet changed. They whisper of playmates beneath the earth, of adults with stretched smiles who taught them wordless songs. They draw symbols on their walls. They press their ears to the floorboards at night. The replacement, it seems, never ended. It continues patiently, methodically, one family at a time. The doorway the Pruitts opened in 1776 remains ajar, and what waits beneath the Ozark hills has never stopped reaching upward. Perhaps the true terror of the Pruitt mystery is not what happened to a single family, but what began with them. A process still unfolding in silence and shadow, hidden behind locked archives and collapsed cave mouths, denied by officials who know more than they will say. But patterns once set tend to repeat themselves, and doors once opened are not so easily closed. In the forests of the Ozarks, something waits. Something that wears familiar faces and speaks with borrowed voices. Something that has been patient for centuries. And it is still hungry.